It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight's story is not for the faint of heart, or the sensitive of nose. We're traveling to a time when the air itself seemed cursed thick with smoke, bile, and the putrid perfume of a continent in decay. This is the story of how the Black Death actually smelled, of what it meant to live through history's most notorious plague, not in numbers or theories, but in breath and stench and rot. If you find yourself strangely comforted by the grotesque honesty of the past, I hope you'll stay a while. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, feel free to subscribe, but only if it feels right. No pressure. Tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it? Now dim the lights, and let's drift back in time, into the foul, suffocating breath of the 14th century. They didn't know what it was, not at first. No plagues were declared, no saints were summoned. But still, something had shifted. The butchers of Messina were the first to truly notice. Their noses were trained, after all, familiar with the clean slice of pig's blood and the sweetly metallic tinge of fresh entrails. They knew what normal death smelled like, and this wasn't it. It wasn't just the cargo ships from the east, though yes, they arrived with bodies already stiff, mouths frozen in a rictus of agony, rats already scuttling through the ropes. It wasn't even the coughing sailors who died before their feet touched land. It was the wind. That strange, warm, oily breeze that clung to stone walls like sweat and didn't leave. Within days, the odor began to spread faster than rumors. A sour, clinging musk that turned the stomach and dulled the appetite. Shopkeepers left citrus peels on windowsills. Monks burned juniper. Mothers dabbed rosewater on their children's collars. And still, it crept in. By the second week, you could smell the docks from the cathedral. By the third, funerals outnumbered weddings tenfold. But here's the thing they don't often teach you. The fear didn't set in because of the dead. It set in because of the smell. The medieval world was loud with belief. People thought sin had a scent, that moral rot leaked through pores, that miasma was a divine punishment made literal. You didn't just get sick. The air turned against you. God turned his face. And your nose knew it before your soul did. Imagine walking into town and smelling something off. Not rancid, not sharp, but wrong. Like the earth had exhaled something it was never meant to release. Like decay had moved in before death had even taken hold. Some tried to rationalize. It's the swamp, they said. Too many lepers. It's the spices rotting in the sun. But under their breath, they whispered darker things. A punishment, a reckoning, a sign. And still the breeze blew, low and humid and strange. The scholars of Salerno recorded that even their tinctures spoiled faster. That wine turned sour in the bottle. That parchment yellowed in the dark. They began stuffing cloves into orange rinds and tying them to their belts' primitive masks of scent against a force they couldn't name. Some lit fires in every room, believing the smoke could cleanse what the soul could not. But it didn't work, because the plague hadn't truly arrived yet. Not in numbers, not in boils, not in death counts scrawled on monastery walls, just in scent. And that was somehow worse. It's one thing to see your neighbor collapse. It's another to smell them decomposing before they hit the ground. The human mind, when frightened, fills gaps with stories, and the smell left many gaps to fill. It wasn't just foul, it was confusing. It changed from street to street. One alley reeked of burnt wool and sour vinegar, another of raw onions and blood. Some said it reminded them of war-of siege camps, where latrines overflowed and horses died in their traces. Others compared it to sulfur or mold, or the breath of something very old. People began to map their cities, not by church bells or market stalls, but by stench. "Don't go by the tannery today," they'd whisper. "The air's wrong." Even noblemen, far removed from gutters and gutter snipes, began hanging perfumed cloth from their balconies. They could afford apothecaries, but not immunity. And so the theories came. First, miasma, the old Roman idea, revived and rotting anew. That disease came not from touch or curse or sin, but from foul air that had been corrupted, poisoned by rot or eclipse or earthquake. They said the ground had opened near Lake Geneva and released a vapor, or that a tremor in Asia had cracked the sky itself. Some claimed a comet had passed too low, dragging the heavens waste with it. And there was a curious comfort in this. If the air was sick, maybe it could be cleaned. Fire, smoke, herbs, these became ritual more than remedy. People carried torches even in daylight. They burned pitch in iron bowls outside their homes. Some wore garlic necklaces until the skin beneath blistered. But still, the smell lingered. The poor believed it came from the rich. Too much decadence, too many unburied secrets. The rich, in turn, blamed the poor and uncivil, too many bodies packed into too little space. And always, someone was blamed. Foreigners, Jews, witches, midwives, anyone who smelled different, lived different, or prayed too much or not enough. In Avignon, the papal court insisted on rose water and mint under every bench. One cleric refused to meet indoors for weeks, convinced that wood paneling trapped disease. He claimed his own sweat began to smell like vinegar and death, though no one else noticed. And maybe he was right, because that was the worst part. Once the plague truly took hold, you couldn't trust your own nose anymore. Some swore they could smell the illness on themselves, so sharp, like bad meat under the skin. Others said the dying began to reek before they fell ill. That breath itself turned metallic. That people began to sweat blood-tinged liquid. That the smell of a person's fear was a warning stronger than any doctor's diagnosis. The medical faculty in Paris argued this point for weeks. They dissected pigs, chickens, even a few heretics. But the scent would not be pinned down. It changed, adapted, played tricks. One plague doctor scribbled in the margins of his notebook, "It is not death that terrifies me. It is the way my nostrils seem to know it's coming." And still the people burned more herbs, hung more charms, chanted more prayers. But every measure taken only confirmed the suspicion that the world had turned sick. Not the people, not the cities, the very air. And when the wind changed direction, so did the fear. You could spot them from a distance. Not by the sound, though they were often quiet, unnaturally so. Not even by the black-marked doors, or the priests muttering outside, but by the smell. The plague houses. A sick house in Florence was described by one monk as a place where the air never moved. He meant it literally. Windows were shuttered, doors sealed, even the chimneys stopped up. In trying to contain the disease, they trapped the stench. Inside, a bouquet of horror. Not just the smell of death, though that was present thick, heavy, unmistakable, but a whole orchestra of odor, sweat gone sour, feces in corners, pus from bursting buboes, thick and rank, urine soaked into straw, candle wax mixed with burning hair. The human body, when it collapses, does not go quietly, and then the attempts to mask it. Pots of vinegar, refilled daily, piles of rosemary and wormwood stuffed into the eaves. Some households kept pots of tar burning around the clock. Others smeared their walls with pitch or lime, trying to smother what they could not clean. But none of it worked. The stench soaked into the wood, the linens, even the skin. Midwives who had attended childbirths said the plague rooms smelled worse than stillbirth. Old soldiers said it was worse than battlefield wounds. One man said it was like the breath of hell itself. And still, they stayed. There were no hospitals for most, no grand ward with white sheets and clean water. For the poor, the plague came home and stayed there. Rooms with 7 or 8 people, sharing the same bed, the same chamber pot, the same slowly thickening air. Windows were feared. Doctors advised against drafts, thinking wind might carry the disease further. So the houses stayed sealed, even as bodies blackened and blistered, even as breath grew shallow and sweat pooled beneath still limbs. Sometimes, the smell got so bad that neighbors threw torches at the walls, trying to burn the house down. In Venice, there were laws against it, but in practice, enforcement was minimal. Because everyone knew, by the time a house stank like that, it was already too late. There were stories, quiet, whispered, half-true, of children too small to understand, living among corpses for days, drinking spoiled water, sleeping beside bloated bodies. Some even survived, crawling out to a street empty of footsteps, blinking into the sun, reeking of mildew and blood. One of them later wrote, "I think I was alive because I could not smell it. I did not know I should have been afraid." But most remembered. They remembered the way their own homes turned against them, the way the door shut for the last time, the way even the cat fled, unable to bear the scent, and the way the silence was not truly silent, because smell, when strong enough, becomes a kind of sound, a roar in the nostrils, a scream in the blood. That's what the plague houses were, not just sites of sorrow, but proof that even the walls could rot. And so came the age of frantic perfume, of every cobbler, cook, and cardinal turning to scent, not as luxury, but as armor. The markets began to change. Oranges, once prized for flavor, were hoarded for their rinds. Vinegar prices soared. Apothecaries ran out of cinnamon by the first frost. Lavender was stripped from the hills before it could bloom. It wasn't just a question of hygiene, it was a question of survival. Smell, people believed, was the first line of defense. If you could sweeten the air around you, you could keep the poison out. So people bathed in rosewater until their skin cracked. They stuffed sachets of cloves into their collars. They rubbed mint on their foreheads and thyme beneath their arms. Some carried nosegays, little bundles of herbs held to the face like a shield. Others carried pomanders, ornate balls made of gold or silver, filled with resin and spice. Worn around the neck or waist, they became a status symbol, a sign that you were trying, at least, to fight back. But it wasn't just for defense. It was ritual. The act of perfuming was meditative. You lit the candle, you warmed the oil, you anointed the doorframe. It gave the illusion of control. In a world where your child could die by dusk, control was a precious lie. And so they believed, fiercely, desperately, that their rituals mattered. In Paris, midwives carried bundles of rue wrapped in silk, whispering Latin prayers as they passed plague houses. In Prague, men lit sulfur at sunrise and let it smolder until noon. In London, people dug pits in their gardens and filled them with oranges, hoping the scent would rise up through the floorboards and bless the lungs. There's a kind of madness in that, but also a kind of poetry, a belief that something beautiful, something fragrant could stand between them and the abyss. Of course, it didn't work. The dead still came, the rot still spread, the air still thickened, but the rituals remained, even as bodies were carted away. even as mass graves opened like new mouths in the earth. The perfumes stayed, because the alternative was to smell what was really happening, to face the raw, unfiltered truth of it, that people were dying by the thousands, that the streets reeked of decay, that no herb, no spice, no flower could cover what was being lost, and so they perfumed the world, not to fight death, but to distract the senses, to sweeten the sorrow, to pretend, for a moment, that something holy still lingered in the air. Even as the wind turned foul again, there comes a moment in every city's collapse when it stops smelling like itself, not just because of the death, but because everything else ... vanishes. The bread ovens stop baking, the candles stop dripping, the horses are gone, the markets emptied, the incense burned away, the smells of living, the sweat of work, the iron of tools, the ash of warm chimneys disappear. And that's when you know it's truly over. That moment came quietly in city after city, a day when the bells stopped ringing for the dead, not because death had ceased, but because there was no one left to ring them. No priests, no mourners, no pallbearers, only silence and the smell. One Venetian chronicler described it as a scent with no edges. It filled everything, but you couldn't find where it began. It was not sharp or sudden anymore. It had softened into something ambient, something inescapable, like living inside a wound. He said it followed him even in sleep, that he dreamed of flowers rotting on the stem, of water thick with blood, of perfume that curdled in the air before it reached the nose. He was one of the last to leave his quarter. He wrote his final entries on a bench in the square, where children used to play. There is no laughter, he wrote. Even the dogs have fled. The wind brings only the smell of forgetting. By then, people were covering their mouths, not with cloths, but with hands. They had run out of faith in remedies, out of herbs, out of explanations, and still their bodies remembered. The gag reflex, the cold sweat, the way your throat tightens when death is near, even before you know what you're smelling. Some said the plague had changed them forever, that even after it passed, food never tasted the same, that love smelled different, that sleep came only in short, sour bursts. They had lived too long inside decay, and decay had followed them out. Years later, travelers returned to the cities, hoping to find life where only loss had remained. They reopened shops, whitewashed walls, planted basil and marjoram in the empty gardens, but nothing grew the same. The soil had changed, the air was still, the bells were rusted, and even when laughter returned, even when bread was baked again and wax poured new and clean, there were moments, sudden and inexplicable, when the wind would shift and something old would rise again, a whiff of pitch, a trace of rot, a memory in the nose, and people would pause, because they remembered, even if they tried to forget, even if they wanted to move on. The air, once thickened, never truly cleared. It just learned to hide. In the world before thermometers, smell was a kind of prophecy. You didn't need charts or microscopes. You had your senses, the breath of a patient, the scent of a wound, the strange, buttery reek of infected sweat. Medieval physicians were trained, above all, to notice. Smell was not just symptom, it was omen. They carried their knowledge like alchemists. This pus means warmth, that stink means fever. A fruit-sweet breath might signal blood infection. A sulphurous temps, the gut. If the mouth turned sour, they said, prepare the shroud. And they were not entirely wrong. The human body does speak in scent. Rot has its own dialect. When cells die, they release chemicals. When blood sits too long, it turns. When organs fail, the nose knows before the mind does. But what haunted plague doctors wasn't what they could identify. It was what they couldn't, because the plague didn't follow rules. It didn't always announce itself in the same way. One patient would reek of filth and bile, the next of nothing at all. Some smelled like they had already died. Others, sweet and clean, dropped dead by evening. The inconsistency drove healers mad. They tried everything: burned feathers, boiled urine, sniffed wounds by candlelight. They catalogued what they could, but the patterns never held. And worse, began to imagine smells that weren't there. One account from Lübeck tells of a young physician who became convinced he could smell the exact moment someone's soul began to rot. He said it was like violets turned to mold, sweet and sick at once. He went mad within a month. Another doctor in London insisted on walking barefoot into plague houses, claiming the smell couldn't harm him if he welcomed it. He died after 3 days, but most did what they could. They wrapped their faces, not just for protection, but to dull their senses, because too much knowledge is sometimes a curse. And to smell death day after day in its early notes and final chords, that is too much knowing. So they turned inward, started trusting less in their noses and more in routine. Bloodletting, purging, leeches futile perhaps, but blessedly scentless. And slowly, the art of diagnosis by smell began to fade, replaced by fear, by gloves and robes, by distance. And yet, some nurses still say they can smell death, even today. That moment in a hospital room when the air changes, when the human body begins to say goodbye before any machine can confirm it. It is not always unpleasant, just final, a warmth leaving, a door closing, a trace in the air. There are few images more infamous than that of the plague doctor. The long black robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves, the staff, the gleaming glass of the eyes. But most haunting of all, the beak, like something from a bad dream or a masquerade gone horribly wrong. It wasn't a mask for anonymity. It was a mask of survival. That beak, long and curved like a bird of carrion, wasn't meant to terrify. It was meant to protect. It held within it an entire apothecaris soaked in vinegar, petals of dried rose and lavender, shavings of cinnamon and nutmeg, even small lumps of ambergris. It was a mobile garden rotting with beauty, because they believed, fiercely and absolutely, that what you breathed determined what you became. If the plague was carried on foul air on miasma, then your only defense was to change the air around your face, to create your own tiny world of scent. Imagine walking into a plague house with your nose full of cloves. The bodies are there, blackened and blistered. The moans of the dying, the twitch of limbs in final fever. But all you smell is spice, sweet, biting, warm. You are standing in death, but your nose is in a bakery. It's not just medicine, it's a lie, a mercy, a way to keep going. Because without that mask, that perfume, that tiny barrier of illusion, how could you walk into those rooms? How could you smell what was really there? Flesh turned soup, organs liquefying, skin splitting from pressure, the inescapable scent of human beings breaking down in real time. Some doctors never removed their masks, even at home. The smell, they said, got into the beard, into the soul. Others confessed to becoming addicted to the herbs inside, the comfort of orange, peel, and mint, the control, a chosen scent in a world where nothing else could be chosen. But the beak didn't save them. Many doctors died anyway. The plague did not respect herbs or hope or hierarchy. Still, the beak remains, not as a relic of science, but of fear, of the desperate need to believe that scent could save us, that something as gentle as lavender might hold back the tide. It didn't, but it gave them courage, and that, perhaps, was enough. There are graves, and then there are pits. The plague did not afford the luxury of burial as we understand it. There were no drawn-out farewells, no carved stones or hymns sung in the key of grief. There was only the cart, the ditch, and the dirt, and the smell. It began before the shovels ever touched the soil. Before dawn, before any bell rangeth, it rang at all you could smell the coming day. Not the freshness of dew, not the smoke of early hearths, but the low, cloying musk of too many bodies waiting to be moved. When death came in hundreds each day, space vanished, cemeteries overflowed. The gravediggers, exhausted and fevered themselves, turned to common pits-long trenches where bodies were laid one on top of the other, sometimes by the dozen. Lime was sprinkled to mask the odor, to hasten decay. It did not work. What they were burying was not just flesh, it was evidence of panic, of failure, of the sheer magnitude of human endings in so little time. Eyewitnesses described the scent as hot even in winter, as if the earth was sweating, as if the dead were exhaling back into the world. One priest wrote that he could smell the graves from his chapel even with all the windows shuttered. He said it came up through the floorboards, that it made the candles flicker, that his sermons grew shorter, choked off by nausea, and the wind carried it into bakeries, into schools, into the folds of laundry hung out to dry. The living could not escape it, even indoors. And so they began to fear the graves themselves, not just as a place of endings, but as a source of poison. They started building them farther away, then farther still. But smell, like grief, knows how to travel. Some children began playing a game, guessing the number of bodies in a pit by the strength of the scent. They would run past with their noses covered, laughing through their fear. Others simply stopped going outside. In some cities, the scent marked a kind of perimeter. People would not go beyond a certain point, not because of danger in the usual sense, but because the air turned too thick, too loaded, too unkind. There is a wordless truth in that even the soil, when asked to hold too much sorrow, begins to speak, and that we hear it not with our ears, but with our noses. If you had money, the plague didn't smell like rot. It smelled like lavender, sachets tucked into silk drawers, like the burning of rare wood cedar, sandalwood oud. It smelled like privilege. In Florence, the nobles fled the cities early, to the hills, to their country estates, far from the crowded breath of the poor. They took their perfumers with them, their doctors, their favorite spices. They dined in fragrant halls, windows thrown open to mountain breezes. They held masked balls and recited poetry. And all the while, they dabbed rose oil onto their temples to calm the humors. They drank wines steeped with violet and saffron. They lined their rooms with hyssop and bay. The idea was simple. If the world outside was rotting, then make the inside beautiful. If you couldn't change fate, you could at least sweeten it. One lord in Provence refused to eat anything that hadn't been passed through scented smoke. He insisted his servants perfume the dogs. He burned so many rare woods that the air itself turned blue. And still he died, because the plague does not recognize incense. But for a while, the illusion held. There's something deeply human about it, that reflex to overlay horror with ritual, to pretend the air isn't full of death if it also smells like cinnamon. Some physicians encouraged the delusion. They sold perfumes with names like Angel's Breath and Deathbane. Expensive, elaborate concoctions that were more fantasy than remedy. Bottled comfort. They made fortunes, and it worked, in a way, not on the plague, but on the mind. Because for a time, if you were rich enough, you could almost forget the carts on the roads below. Forget the smoke rising from town after town. Forget that no matter how much oil you poured into your skin, the blood beneath was no different than theirs. But the illusion cracked eventually. Servants began to die, then children, then wives. And still they tried. They sealed themselves in perfumed rooms. They wore gloves soaked in amber. They paid bards to sing louder, longer, over the silence. But the air, sweet as it was, still betrayed them, because scent doesn't lie, and death always finds a way in. Eventually, the plague subsided, or rather it moved on. It never truly ended. It simply grew tired of one place and found another. The bells began again, haltingly. Shops reopened. Children ventured into the streets. Life, in the stubborn way of life, returned. But the air didn't forget. Those who survived carried a kind of phantom scent with them. A sense memory so deep it lived not just in the nose, but in the marrow. They smelled it in their dreams. In fresh bread that reminded them, too closely, of body heat. In wet wool. In the smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Some survivors became obsessed with cleanliness. Not for hygiene, but for erasure. They scrubbed their walls with vinegar until the paint peeled. Burned every garment touched during the worst months. Buried their mattresses. Painted crosses over every lintel. Boiled their hairbrushes. They weren't trying to prevent a new plague. They were trying to wash away the old one. Others went the opposite way. They refused to clean at all. They let the dust settle, let the linens mildew, as if trying to hold on to something that no longer had a name, a grief uncleaned, a sorrow not yet ready to be rinsed. And then there were those who simply went quiet, who stopped noticing smell altogether, who drifted through markets, noses dulled, eyes forward. They didn't comment on the flowers in spring. They didn't flinch at latrines. Something in them had shut off. We don't talk about that much in history books. The smell of what remains. The way the body remembers long after the fever breaks. But survivors do. A widow in Bruges wrote that for years she could not touch clothes, that her wedding gown had been stored with them, that every time she opened the trunk, she gagged not from memory, but from scent. Another man said he could no longer bear incense. It reminded him of death rites, of half-said prayers and smoke curling up from unmarked graves. And there were those who claimed they could still smell the plague in certain streets, even decades later, that a hot wind in late summer brought it back, that the scent of death lingers, not because it is real, but because it was once too real to forget. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps every city that has suffered still carries it just beneath the surface. A breath held in the stones, a note beneath the song, an after-smell of survival. When medicine fails, people reach for God, and when prayers feel unanswered, they turn to ritual. In the plague years, churches were filled not just with supplicants, but with smells. Incense thick as fog, myrrh, frankincense, and storax burned in swinging censers until the rafters dripped with smoke. The goal was twofold: to please the divine and to purify the air, holy scent as holy shield, because if foul odors brought death, then sweet ones must bring life, The logic was almost childlike. If rot was sin, then fragrance was virtue. A moral algebra played out in the nose. The processionals became olfactory pageants. Priests, draped in embroidered vestments, walked through the streets, clouds of scent rising in their wake. Boys carried torches, girls threw petals. People fell to their knees as the holy cloud passed over them, inhaling as if faith itself could be drawn into the lungs. In some cities, relics were perfumed bones of saints rubbed with balm, bits of cloth anointed with oil. People waited hours for a chance to smell them, to lean in, eyes closed, and inhale a holiness that might spare them. But it wasn't always divine. Sometimes it was desperate. In Spain, processions walked barefoot over coals, carrying thuribles so heavy they scorched their hands. In Poland, entire congregations inhaled so much incense they collapsed in the pews, gasping through the smoke, eyes watering not from belief, but from burning lungs. There were those who said it was too much, that even the sacred began to stink. A bishop in Germany wrote, "The air inside the cathedral is thick with the perfume of desperation. God cannot smell us over the noise." Still, they kept burning. Because what else was there? The hospitals stank. The doctors wore beaks. The dead came too fast to name. But the church still smelled beautiful, even if the beauty was false. Even if the air turned foul again the moment the candles guttered out. Even if the faithful died just the same, they died with the scent of roses in their nostrils. And for some, that was enough. Fear is inventive. When science fails and saints are slow to answer, people begin to craft their own salvations, more portable, scented. During the worst waves of plague, entire industries arose not from medicine or prayer, but from superstition. And always these protections smelled. Herbal amulets, bundles of sage, marjoram, wrapped in cloth and tied with red string, hung from necks, sewn into sleeves, stuffed into children's shoes. Every home had its own recipe. Every grandmother swore by a different blend. In Paris, mothers wore necklaces of crushed mint and dried citrus. In Prague, boys kept little wax balls in their pockets, filled with pine, resin, and ash. In York, women stitched tiny pouches of nutmeg and cloves into their corsets, close to the heart. The message was simple. If death came sniffing, you'd better smell like something stronger. Street vendors knew this. They walked with carts rattling, shouting their charms through linen masks. Protection for the lungs, deathbane, hand-wrapped. Kiss your children with cinnamon breath, keep them safe through the storm. They sold scent the way others sold hope, and people bought it. They had to. Not because they truly believed a walnut stuffed with lavender could halt a pandemic, but because it gave their hands something to do. Because fear left idle rots. But fear, braided into rosemary and tied to the bedpost, becomes manageable. Some households became shrines of smell. Doors lined with garlic, windowsills crowded with basil and wormwood, bedsheets soaked in vinegar. Not to sleep better, but to prove to the air itself that they were fighting. It became competitive. One Venetian merchant bragged that he owned 47 scented medallions and had burned a different tree resin each morning since the first cough. His neighbors, impressed, began importing camphor from Cairo, even as their servants dropped dead. The plague did not care. It moved through their scented houses, ignored their talismans, stepped over their charms. But still they tried, because humans are not built to accept helplessness. We build meaning from smell. We braid herbs and whisper Latin and press citrus oil to our wrists because we must do something. even if that something is small, even if the lie smells sweeter than the truth. When the air turns foul, someone must be blamed. It's an ancient instinct older than cities, older than language. When animals sense a predator, they don't ask why the wind shifted. They run. Humans, in their frightened brilliance, invent reasons. During the Black Death, smell became a weapon, not just against disease, but against each other. Foreigners were the first to fall under suspicion. Travelers, traders, strangers with unfamiliar spices on their breath. Scent was proof of difference, of danger. If you smelled like cardamom and musk instead of rye and ash, you were suspect. Next came the Jews. Across Europe, ancient hatreds ignited with fresh terror. Rumors spread that wells were being poisoned, that secret powders were being burned, that disease had a scent and that scent was carried by them. It didn't matter that many of these communities had died too, or that they had the same herbs stuffed in their walls, the same rosemary tied to their children's cribs. In Cologne, a rabbi was stoned for smelling of vinegar and secrets. In Basel, entire neighborhoods were razed, the air thick with smoke and accusations, and still the plague spread. Witches were next, midwives who had too many tinctures, women whose homes smelled too clean, too strange, too herbal. The line between healer and heretic blurred quickly when the nose took the lead. If your neighbor was still healthy, people sniffed for reasons. Was her breath different? Her bread? Her chimney smoke? If it was, she must be hiding something. A pact, a powder, a spell. The accused rarely stood a chance. Because you can't defend a smell. You can't argue with a nose already turned against you. Even healers once revered became targets. If their homes didn't smell like grief, they must be cheating death. If their hands didn't stink of sweat and salt, they must have struck a bargain. The very act of surviving became suspicious. One Italian woman was burned after neighbors claimed her hair carried the scent of lavender even during mourning. She swore it was from a pillow sachet. They didn't believe her. The scent of fear, once loosed, cannot be recalled. It lingers, festers, turns to hatred faster than fire. And in the end, the plague killed the innocent just as easily as the guilty. It did not care who had burned basil or boiled leeks. It swept through perfumed homes and cursed streets alike. But the violence remained, the smell of smoke and judgment, of crowds shouting, of wood catching flame beneath the feet of someone whose only crime was smelling different. The funerals, at first, were quiet, muted, intimate. A last kiss on a cold forehead, a wreath of herbs, a hymn murmured in the throat like an apology. But as the death toll rose, the pageantry grew, because when grief becomes unmanageable, it becomes spectacle. And scent was part of the script. The early dead, those buried before the plague became unstoppable, were still afforded ceremony. They were washed, anointed, dressed in linen and perfume, not for the dead's comfort, but for the living's memory. You could still inhale and say, "He died clean." But as bodies mounted, the rituals changed. Priests stopped entering homes. Families began to dress their dead in whatever garments they had not burned. And the perfume turned from grace to camouflage. You no longer anointed your loved one out of reverence. You did it so the stench wouldn't give them away, because neighbors would talk, because you needed another day to find a cart, because a sweet-smelling corpse could still pass as sleeping. They used everything: oil of lavender, wine boiled with sage, fennel steeped in honey. They soaked handkerchiefs in lemon and pressed them into dead mouths. Some placed sprigs of thyme beneath armpits. Others stuffed rosemary into the chest cavity, as if scent could still reach the soul. It didn't work. The decay came anyway. One undertaker in Naples said that by the time he arrived, most bodies had already begun to swell, that no amount of perfume could overcome the sound the stomach made when it split. But people kept trying, because the alternative raw death, unmasked, was too much. So they staged their grief. They made theater of it. Some cities developed full olfactory ceremonies, a specific scent for the dead child, another for the young bride, a third, darker blendochmus and vetiver, for the old man taken too soon. They burned these scents not to summon the divine, but to remember how to mourn. Because when death comes in thousands, mourning must become ritual, or it stops altogether. A monk in Siena described a funeral that used 30 different herbs, arranged like a choir. We burned them in tears, he wrote, the sweet ones first, then the bitter, then the ones that burned the throat, to remind us of the order of things. The body was gone by the second hour, but the smell lingered, and the scent of the dead stayed longer than memory. By the second year of plague, the markets had changed. They no longer smelled of abundance. The roasted chestnuts, the fresh fish, the warm yeast of morning bread, these were gone. In their place, vinegar, wax, charred herbs, and fear. Vendors stopped shouting. They began to whisper. Some refused to speak at all, gesturing in silence behind gauze masks soaked in wine. Coins were passed through bowls of ash, bread wrapped in cloth, doused with rosemary water. Commerce had become choreography. Every stall was an altar, and scent was the ritual that tied it all together. People didn't just buy goods, they bought the right smells. Apples that had been smoked over juniper, cloth steeped in hyssop, even leather if it had been cured in the proper oils. Everything came with a story, a whispered assurance that it had been made in clean air, far from the rot. One woman in Krakow sold onions wrapped in printed prayers. Another in Marseille offered pears polished with frankincense resin. A spice merchant in Palermo refused to handle silver unless it had been rubbed with clove. There were rules, unwritten but enforced. Touch nothing unwrapped. Smell before you see. Always carry your own sensual shield against whatever foulness the next customer might be carrying. The wealthy, of course, had runners. Servants dispatched with scented gloves to fetch meat and mint and mourning cloth. But even the poor adapted. They soaked their coins in vinegar overnight. They burned feathers at the edge of the market to test the air's mood. And through it all, a hush, because no one wanted to draw attention. A cough could empty the square. A sneeze could mean exile. So people sniffed, watched, waited. The markets, once full of bustle, had become a place of sacred suspicion. And the smell of the metallic, acrid, overlaid with desperate spice, was unforgettable. One poet called it the breath of civilization held too long. Another said it smelled like prayer in retreat, but they kept coming. Because markets are the heartbeat of a city, even when the blood runs thin, even when the air thickens with loss. They bought and sold and burned their herbs and dabbed oil at the base of their necks, not because they believed it would save them, but because that's what people do. They barter, they bless, they breathe, and they hope the next breath won't be their last. Even after the dead were buried, even after the doors were unsealed and the fires put out, and the last of the black flags taken down from windows, the body remembered. It remembered through the nose. For survivors, the scent of plague was not confined to the years it took place. It lived on, like an aftertaste in the lungs, a shadow under the tongue, a ghost scent that clung to the folds of time. A Florentine widow wrote that she could no longer walk past a fig tree in bloom. It reminded her too much of the fevered sweat of her husband, whose body had collapsed beneath one. She uprooted it in silence. Her garden, once lush, became bare. She said it made her breathe easier. Others found themselves haunted by herbs. Rosemary, once used in mourning wreaths, became unbearable. An apothecary in Avignon claimed he'd stopped using lavender entirely. Too many corpses had worn it to their graves. It no longer smelled of fields. It smelled of failure. But not all ghosts were bitter. Some found themselves aching for certain smells. The sour temps of vinegar, the burnt sting of juniper smoke. Not out of nostalgia, but out of survival. They had taught themselves to breathe through these things. They had become, in a way, addicted to the illusion of safety. A young midwife in Nuremberg admitted that she kept a sachet of cloves by her bedside, years after the plague had passed. Not because she feared its return, but because it reminded her of her own courage, of how many nights she had walked into sick rooms, armed with nothing but her nose and her nerve. That is the strange thing about scent. It bypasses the rational mind, travels directly to memory. You do not choose what it evokes. A trace of pitch on a warm breeze, and suddenly you're there again. Back in a shuttered room, listening for coughs, waiting for death, or worse, waiting for someone else to notice that you, too, had begun to smell. Wrong, and for those who buried too many, the nose became the enemy. One man said he began to imagine stench where there was none, that every stranger seemed to carry the scent of something rotting just beneath their skin, that he feared touching his children, lest he bring the smell back into the house. He wasn't alone. A kind of olfactory madness crept through the survivor class. Doctors who recoiled at the smell of ink, bakers who gagged at flour, brides who wept at perfume, because scent is not just memory, it is the echo of pain. And when the nose remembers more than the mind can handle, that too is a kind of plague. You can clean a house, you can scrub the floors, whitewash the walls, throw out the mattresses and hang new curtains in the windows, but you cannot unsmell it, not truly. Long after the Black Death receded, certain homes stood empty not from vacancy, but from memory, from something in the air that didn't fade, that clung to beams and lintels and brick, something too old to be named, but not old enough to be forgotten. In Marseille, there was a row of houses known only as La Ruelle Mute Alley. Every home had once been a plague house. Each had been cleaned, repaired, even blessed. But still, no one stayed. The landlords said it was superstition. The neighbors said it was smell. Visitors reported nothing at first, just quiet, dust. Then something, ... strange, a metallic sourness in the corners, a sweetness that wasn't sweet. The odor of long-dried blood, of sorrow soaked into timber. No one could prove it. But people didn't walk that alley after dark. In Siena, a baker reopened her family home after 12 years. She had survived, but lost everyone. Husband, parents, 3 daughters. She entered with candle and mop and steeled breath. She opened every shutter, hauled out every blanket, washed every surface with lye, and still. She wrote, "At night I smell them. Not death, them, their soap, their sheets, the broth we boiled, and something else beneath, like regret warmed by sleep." She never moved in. Some said the plague had soaked into the mortar, that no amount of scrubbing could unmake what the walls had witnessed. Others believed it was psychological, that grief had its own scent, and once it entered a space, it became permanent. Even new homes struggled. Builders complained of strange scents rising from fresh foundations. Earth like sour milk, one said. Like the land itself is remembering. They burned herbs during construction, planted lavender at every doorstep, anything to convince the nose that the past had passed. But it hadn't, and maybe it never does. Maybe homes remember. Maybe wood learns to breathe in pain and exhale it slowly over decades. Maybe no one ever truly moves in after a plague. They just negotiate with its residue. They light candles. They say prayers. They open windows and pretend the breeze is enough. But in the still moments when the fire is low and the shadows stretch long, they smell it. That whisper of before, that breath of what was lost. That reminder that not all ghosts knock. Some linger in the air, soft as dust, and heavier than silence. There is a strange truth, passed quietly between generations, that children who grow up during plague years do not smell the world the same way. Their senses form in smoke and vinegar. Their lullabies are sung beneath bundles of herbs. Their first memories taste like myrrh, not milk. In Milan, they were called I Nasuti, the nosed ones, not as an insult, as recognition. Children who could identify the sick before symptoms showed, who flinched at the scent of damp linen or unwashed skin, who avoided certain streets long before their parents knew why. No one taught them, they simply knew. One child in Ghent was said to cry every time he entered the family cellar. They thought it was superstition till they found a half-sealed corpse in the wall. Another in Lyon refused to wear the lavender oil her mother offered. She said it was for death. Not perfume, not flowers, just death. These children weren't gifted. They were shaped. Their olfactory world had been built around decay. Their comfort smelled like sterilization. Their fear had an aftershave, and their games frightening. They played plague doctor, stuffing orange peels into masks made of stitched cloth. They sold potions made of dandelion and mint. They held mock funerals for dolls, sprinkling rosemary and whispering borrowed prayers. Adults looked on with a mix of amusement and dread, because they knew what the children didn't. That memory clings hardest when you don't know its memory. That these little rituals weren't just games, they were inheritance. And as these children grew, so did the residue. Many became fastidious, clean to the point of obsession, unable to sit still unless the room had been freshly aired. Their homes smelled of soap and cedar. No warmth, no clutter, just control. Others went the other way, drawn to strong smells, spices, smoke, sweat. As if trying to overwrite something their noses still remembered. One man insisted his bedroom always smell of firewood, not because he liked it, but because anything else reminded him of the sick room where his sister died. Some became physicians. They trusted scent over sound, over sight, a patient's breath, their sweat, the air in the room all noted before a single question was asked, and a few couldn't stand it. They left the cities altogether, sought forests, mountains, air that hadn't been touched by sorrow. One woman wrote, "I moved north, not for the quiet, but for the cold. Nothing rots in the cold." She never returned. These were the plague's truest survivors, not just the ones who lived, but the ones who continued smelling, the ones whose nostrils still twitched at the wrong kind of wind, the ones who would not forget, even when forgetting might have been kinder. Some griefs are so large, they stop smelling. They transcend the senses, become ambient. A part of the air, yes, but not something you can name, not something you can bottle or burn away. During the plague years, there came a moment quiet, awful when the olfactory landscape flattened. People stopped noticing, stopped reacting. The rot, the vinegar, the herbs, the fire all blended into a single, suffocating nothing. It was called the flattening. Doctors noticed it first. They described it clinically: olfactory fatigue, a protective dulling of the nerves, the body's mercy to itself, the only way to keep functioning when every breath brings pain. But the people described it differently. They called it the unsmell, not absence, just ... stillness, as if the nose had shut its doors. One nun wrote, "It is not that the world stopped stinking, it is that I stopped caring." And with this came strange consequences. Meals lost flavor. Candles gave no comfort. Perfume became offensive, cloying, too sharp for such a numb world. Some tried to shock their senses back to life-biting raw garlic, drinking vinegar, burying their faces in dirt. But nothing worked. It wasn't that the smells were gone. It was that grief had flooded every available space. And scent, so tied to memory and emotion, simply surrendered. This unsmell was most common among the grieving widows, midwives, gravediggers, anyone whose life had been measured in bodies. It became a mark of experience, of suffering, and others began to fear it. If someone didn't wrinkle their nose in the market, didn't flinch at sewage, didn't sniff the air when the wind changed, they were marked, not as survivors, but as those who had lost too much. A man in Toulouse said he stopped smelling the plague when he buried his third child. A woman in Vienna said the world smelled like paper for a year, blank, brittle, nothing behind it. And for some, the smell never returned. They went through life, not anosmic, exactly more like the part of their soul that registered fragrance had been folded up and placed away, like winter clothes in summer, not needed anymore. And no one spoke of it, because how do you explain that the worst part of surviving was the absence, that you would have welcomed the rot again just to feel something, that to be unable to smell your mother's soup, your lover's skin, your child's hair in the sun, that was the second death, the one no one wrote down, the one no one lit candles for, the quiet grief, the In the years after the plague, the wind became a storyteller. It moved differently. Or perhaps people just listened more closely. A sudden shift in breeze would make women drop their baskets. Men would pause mid-step. Children would run indoors, not because of anything they saw, but because of what they thought they smelled. It was never strong, just a hint, a curl of smoke without a fire, a whisper of bile on an otherwise clean street, the bitter edge of herbs long out of bloom. It didn't matter if it was real. The nose remembered, the body tensed, and the mind filled in the blanks. Even in cities that had moved on, rebuilt, repopulated, rescented, there were moments when the air slipped, and something old crept in. One chronicler in Rouen recorded that the market emptied for hours after a shipment of wool arrived damp. The smell reminded people of the wrappings around plague dead. The merchant had to burn half his goods. In York, a windstorm one summer carried smoke from a burning field into town. No one could see the source, but the scent, sharp and earthy, too close to burned pitch, caused panic. People fled to the cathedral. The bishop called it a divine test. In Prague, it rained for 5 days, and the streets filled with water that lapped at the old plague pits. The stink rose. People stopped opening their windows. For a week, it felt like the past was breathing again. And so, superstition returned. Sailors refused to dock in harbors that smelled off. Pregnant women burned rosemary during east winds. And perfumers made fortunes once again. Not selling beauty, but selling control. Bottled pine for homes, lavender for pillows, frankincense for doorframes. People scented their lives like fortresses, layer upon layer, as if you could barricade your soul with fragrance. But still, the wind came, not often, just enough, to remind you that the plague was never truly gone, that something, somewhere, still rotted, still whispered, still waited, and in that breath of air, thin, sharp, familiar, you remembered everything. It rarely began with pain, not at first. The body, in its cruel kindness, often gave no warning, no ache, no fever, just a breath, a scent. Something was ... wrong. Some survivors swore they could smell their own sickness coming, that the air changed just before the fever struck, that their sweat turned bitter, that their skin began to leak something sour, something not theirs. It wasn't universal. Not everyone noticed, but those who did never forgot. A widow in Bruges recalled sitting in her kitchen and catching a sudden whiff of copper and milk. She thought it was the pan. Hours later, her son collapsed at her feet. A tanner in Marseille said the moment he began to smell blood on his breath fresh, sharp, unmistakable, he knew he had days. He wasn't wrong. There's something unbearably human in this. To sense your end not in pain or panic or even thought, but in scent. It bypasses denial, moves straight into the marrow, and for those attuned to it, it became a sixth sense. Doctors tried to study it. They took notes, collected sweat, bottled breath. They searched for patterns in the pre-symptomatic, for the scent of what comes before. They hoped to make diagnosis faster, more precise. But it didn't work, because the smell changed. It wasn't consistent. Sometimes it was metallic, other times sour, sometimes earthy, like old leaves. One child said his sister smelled like mushrooms and storms. The physicians were frustrated, but the nurses, they listened. They began to trust their noses, to note when the air around a patient shifted, when the sheets took on a weight, when the pillows began to reek of something not quite death, but close. Some midwives refused to enter rooms that smelled a certain way. They couldn't explain it. They just knew it was the smell before the boils, before the cough, before the blood, the warning. And those who could smell it often had a choice, to stay or to run. Most stayed, even when they knew. Even when the scent said, "You will die if you remain here." They remained, because what is a nose compared to a hand held, compared to a prayer whispered into hair damp with sweat, compared to the smell of someone you love, one last time before the other smell comes. There's a moment small, often silent, when someone begins to die, and the air changes, not drastically, not with fanfare, but subtly, like a curtain shifting in a room you didn't know had a window. Caregivers came to know it well. The plague made experts of them all, not by choice, by necessity. It wasn't always the same smell. That's part of the cruelty. Sometimes it was sweetness, not pleasant cloying, like fruit left too long on a windowsill, ripe with rot just under the skin. Other times it was earthier, like wet stone or old leather, as if the body was returning to the ground before it left the bed. And sometimes it wasn't a scent at all, but an absence, a stillness in the nose, a moment when even the herbs stopped breathing, when even the strongest clove, the richest myrrh, feels thin, a vacuum in the world. One nun described it as the smell of departure. She said it came just before the eyes clouded, just before the breathing changed. Not death, not yet, but the moment before. And in those moments, the living would lean in, not to comfort, but to memorize. Because scent, more than any other sense, is tied to memory. They wanted to remember how their sister smelled before the bile, how their father's breath felt before it went ragged, the exact perfume their wife had pressed behind her ear before she fell ill. They inhaled like archivists, desperate to preserve, even if what they were breathing in was fear, even if their lungs trembled from it. Some wore gloves, others masks, but still they leaned in, close enough to smell the story, the one the body tells just before it ends. And later, when they were alone, they'd try to recall it, to piece it together. Did she smell like violets? No. Like sage? No. Like something warmer? They'd keep sniffing their sleeves, their bedsheets, the collar of the coat she wore, trying to summon her, but it never lasted. Scent fades, even the most vivid, even the ones that once made the soul ache, and so they clung to what they could. Lit candles that smelled vaguely right, pressed rosemary to their temples, drenched letters in rose water, anything to call the scent back from the dark. Because words fail, images blur, but a single breath, caught at the right time, can hold a life. Not all fires were for the dead. Some were for the living. In plague cities, burning became both shield and sacrament. You burned linens, you burned clothes, you burned furniture, floorboards, entire rooms, sometimes even houses, not out of hatred, but out of fear and mercy. Because there were smells you could not scrub away, that clung to fabric and skin and soul. And when the body could no longer bear them, fire was the only answer. In Florence, people set fire to entire wagons of cloth, not because the fabric was stained, but because it had come from a sick house. One woman sobbed as she watched her wedding linens go up in smoke. Better ashes than ghosts, she whispered. In Venice, sailors torched their own ships before docking. The scent of death was still in the sails, they claimed. The harbour masters did not stop them. They stood back and watched the black smoke rise like incense for the condemned. Doctors advised it, not out of superstition, but resignation. When too many patients died in a room, the walls themselves began to turn. The air grew thick. The scent settled into the grain of the wood, into the mortar between stones. No herb could chase it out. And so, Torch, you didn't wait. You doused the room in oil. You spoke no prayers. You lit the match. There was no spectacle in it. No rage, just necessity. Like lancing a wound. Some described the fire as purifying. Others said it was the only smell worse than the plague, the crackle of oil and fat, the pop of wet wood, the iron stink of things that should not burn. And yet they welcomed it, because in the fire the smell ended. It did not fade, it ended. One priest kept a list of things he had burned. 12 beds, 27 blankets, 7 tunics, 4 pairs of shoes, 3 Bibles, 1 door. He wrote, "The nose forgives only what it cannot remember." But the heart, he left that part blank, because the heart remembers even the cleanest of ruins. Even when the air clears, something aches where the scent used to be. Still they burned, and kept burning, until all that remained was smoke, and silence, and a space where something used to be that could finally be called holy. The dogs knew, the cats too, even the birds. Long before the plague carts rolled down cobbled streets, long before the bells tolled twice in a single morning, long before mothers pressed their lips to fevered foreheads and found no blessing there, the animals were already gone. Not all of them, but enough to notice. In Antwerp, one man wrote that the pigeons left the square 2 days before the first body was found slumped by the well. In a village outside Prague, the goats broke from their pen at dusk and would not return. In London, a fishmonger found his alley unusually quiet. No rats, not even the dogs who begged scraps from his stall. That night, he began coughing. People began to talk. They said the animals could smell it, that they could sense what was coming in the air before even the healers, the priests, the dreams, that there was something in the wind they understood. And they were not wrong. Modern science would later confirm what instinct had long whispered. Animals are sensitive to scent in ways we are not. They detect chemicals in sweat, in breath, in soil disturbed too quickly, in rot before it's visible, in fear itself. But back then, it was magic, or curse, or omen. So people watched the animals more closely. If the dogs howled at dusk, they bolted the doors. If the cat refused to enter the bedroom, they moved the bed. If the crows circled too long above the marketplace, some would not shop that day. And if a horse balked at the threshold of a house, they did not go in. Some said it was nonsense, that animals are fickle, easily spooked, but others believed, because they had seen it too many times. A woman in Marseille swore her dog growled at her husband 3 days before the boils appeared. A merchant in Cologne claimed his parrot screamed whenever the servants came near till the day 3 of them died within hours. And what's more, once the plague took hold, the animals didn't just flee, they hid, they turned feral, they ran to the hills. They watched from a distance, eyes bright in the dark, as humans flailed and burned and begged and buried. They did not come to comfort, they did not offer company. They waited until the air was clean again, until the world no longer smelled like despair. Then, one by one, they returned, and the silence of their absence, like the absence of scent after a storm, remained long after. Because sometimes the first warning is not a sound, not a sign, not even a smell. Sometimes it is what refuses to come near. It began with a rumor that in certain houses, usually old ones, with too many shutters and not enough light, the walls had begun to breathe. Not literally, of course, not with lungs, but with scent, as if the stone and plaster had absorbed too much, too many cries, too many fevers, too many last breaths, now exhaled it slowly, rhythmically, like sighs in a cathedral. At first, people dismissed it. Just damp, just mildew, old wood playing tricks. But it kept happening. The scent was never strong, just enough to turn heads, to furrow brows, just enough to make someone stop in the middle of a sentence and ask, "Did you smell that?" One moment, nothing, the next something. A breath of camphor, a hint of rot. Something sharp, then gone. Gone, but not forgotten. And the worst part was, it came in rhythm, as if the house itself was remembering. A priest in Avignon refused to sleep indoors after encountering it. He said the chapel walls wept oil, that the air pulsed like breath, that it smelled not of incense, but of old wounds reopening. Scholars tried to explain. Fungal bloom, perhaps. Pressure shifts in damp cellars, air trapped behind paint. But the survivors didn't care. They began to seal rooms, not from plague, but from memory. Entire wings of homes were left to dust. Attics were bricked up, basements padlocked. Not because they were unsafe, but because they whispered, because their breath was no longer trusted. Some houses were burned, others abandoned. The streets grew teeth again. Children dared each other to stand by the walls and wait for the breath, to count the seconds between the exhalations, to try not to inhale. A girl in Toulouse wrote in the margins of her diary, "It came again last night. 3 breaths bitter, like old soup and old fear." No one ever taught her that phrase. She just knew. Because some things do not need teaching. Because trauma lives in the body. And sometimes the body is a house. And sometimes the house remembers. And sometimes the wind moves just right, and the stones of the cellar let out a sigh, and you realize the plague never left. It just settled in, deep, quiet, breathing. There is a strange, almost cruel moment at the edge of death when the body becomes beautiful again. Not in sight, in scent. It is brief, deceptive, and it has broken many hearts. During the Black Death, some noted this phenomenon with dread, that in the final hours, sometimes minutes, the sick would suddenly stop stinking. The sweat would sweeten. The breath would lose its sour edge. The air around the body would go still, almost clean. It gave false hope. Mothers leaned closer. Lovers wept with relief. She's recovering, they'd say. The smell is gone. But it was never recovery. It was retreat. A final lull. A momentary grace before collapse. One physician from Padua recorded dozens of these episodes. He called them la tregua, dei sensi, the truce of the senses. He said it was as if the body, knowing its time had come, offered a final kindness to those who stayed beside it. Or perhaps it was nature. The nervous system shutting down, glands silenced, the chemical storm of decay simply delayed. Whatever it was, it lied. It made people stay longer, hold tighter, hope harder, and when the end came, it was crueler for it, because the air had promised otherwise. Perfume merchants capitalized on this strange truth. They began to sell restorative blends, scents they claimed could keep the dying sweet-smelling through their final hours. Rose oil, cinnamon, amber, the illusion of recovery, bottled and sold. Some believed, not in the cure but in the comfort. They said if your wife died smelling like roses, it was easier to let go. They said if your child passed with lavender on their breath, the grief was quieter. One bishop argued against it, called it a sin of olfactory pride, said we were fragrancing our fear, but no one listened, because the truth was, it worked. It helped, even if it was a lie, even if it meant confusing death for life for just a moment longer. Because sometimes, a lie that smells like love is more bearable than the truth that reeks of absence. They looked impressive, tall, draped in black, faces hidden behind glass eyes and bird-like beaks. The plague doctors. Their presence was meant to comfort, to project order, science, intervention. But what they brought, more than anything, was smell. The air changed when they entered a room. No longer the dampness of sweat or the fetid breath of fever, but a bright, choking cloud of clove, rose, mint, and vinegar. A medicinal halo. A wall of fragrance so dense it could make you dizzy. Patients whispered, they smell like death, pretending to be health. Because that's what it was. Pretend. Their remedies rarely worked. Their instruments were crude. Their training, if they had any, was outdated before the ink on their credentials dried. But they had their scent. Their beaks were packed with pomanders, their gloves soaked in oil, their robes dusted with crushed herbs. Not because it helped the sick, but because it helped them stay. To walk through filth and fire without vomiting. To stand over children gasping in their mother's lap and breathe. Anything else? Some swore the scent made them brave. Others admitted it numbed them. One young doctor in Milan wrote, I do not know how many died today. I only remember the cloves. And maybe that was the point. Because when faced with a wall of suffering, it's easier to focus on the smell, on the layer of cinnamon in the air, on the sharpness of vinegar in your nose, than on the boy who cannot lift his head, or the woman who has not moved in hours, or the pile of bodies behind the curtain. Fragrance became their shield, their disguise, their ritual. They would light their censers before entering a room. They would dab oil onto their gloves with a reverence usually reserved for sacraments. One doctor recited the same words each time. Let no rot enter my mind. Let no breath become mine. But some still broke. They'd tear off the mask mid-round, gasp, weep, flee. Because even through the perfume, the truth seeped in. The smell of death is clever. It waits. It learns the gaps in the mask, the soft places in the heart. And when it finds them, it lingers. Long after the gloves are removed, long after the beak is hung, long after the doctor, scented and silent, has forgotten his own name. They were meant to protect. Waxed cloth, stuffed beaks, layers of herbs and spice. The plague masks were not costumes, not at first. They were engineering, desperate, sincere. People thought disease was in the air, so they tried to change the air, filter it, sweeten it, bend it to human will. Every breath was suspect, every breath an invitation to death. So they masked, not just doctors, ordinary people. Women stitched layers of wool soaked in vinegar. Children were taught to wrap scarves tight around nose and mouth. Butchers wore sacks tied with twine. The poor used rags steeped in soot and salt. And still they died, because the masks didn't work. Not the leather beaks, not the linen wraps, not the perfumed gauze. The plague came anyway, through fleas, through rats, through touch, breath, luck, fate. But they kept wearing them, because the lie was better than the alternative, because the scent of rosemary in your nostrils was easier to carry than the scream in your lungs. Some masks became heirlooms, passed from one family member to the next, worn thin with use, darkened with oil and fear. Others were burned when their wearers died, too saturated with sorrow to keep. One midwife, maskless for days, broke down sobbing over a child she could not save. She tore a sheet into strips, boiled cloves and honey, and made a new mask by moonlight. Not because she thought it would save her, because it gave her a reason to stay. The ritual mattered, the pressing of cloth to face, the scent, the weight, the heat. It was something to hold. And when the masks came off, if they ever did, it was like shedding armor. One merchant said he didn't recognize his own wife the first time he saw her barefaced after 3 months. I thought I was kissing a stranger, he wrote. Her breath was not vinegar, her skin was not waxed, and I wept. Not from love, from the sudden, shattering memory of what life used to smell like. Before death wore perfume, before masks became faces, before scent became salvation, and then deception. They meant well, the survivors, the ones who stayed behind to rebuild, to recede, to reclaim. After the plague subsided, they turned to the land, not just for food, for comfort, for forgetting. They planted gardens everywhere. In courtyards once filled with funeral carts, in alleys scrubbed raw with lie, in the shadows of empty churches and the corners of plague-pitted fields, the gardens bloomed furiously, defiantly. Lavender, sage, marjoram, basil, thyme, the same herbs that once lined the windows of the dying. The same petals crushed beneath feet in the rush to flee. The same stalks burned in the fevered dark. Now replanted, nurtured. They said it was healing. But the scent told another story. A woman in Bruges said, her garden smelled too familiar, too sharp, too much like mourning. I cannot walk through my rosemary without seeing her face, she wrote. Her daughter, wrapped in those same leaves, buried beneath that same soil. A monk in Aragon tended a plot of thyme and rue. He wept every spring, said the air grew thick with ghosts, because the herbs remembered, their oils clung to grief. Their roots reached into ground that had soaked too much. Even flowers, meant to comfort, became uncanny. Violets sprouting where mass graves once sank. Poppies blooming redder than before. People began to speak of Giardini Bugiardi, the Lyre Gardens, so lovely, so fragrant, so false, because they masked the truth, that the ground was not pure, that the air was not free of memory, that every breeze carried a trace of the dead, not haunting, just persistence. One child said the garden made her dizzy, that the scent of mint gave her nightmares, that basil made her stomach hurt. Her mother told her to hush, that healing required patience. But what if the nose doesn't want to heal? What if it wants to remember? What if the sweetness is the wound? And the garden, however tender, however green, is just another kind of grave. It was supposed to fade. That was the promise. That when the plague was over, when the bells rang again, when the shutters came down, when the dead were laid to rest, the smells would leave with it. That the sweetness, so carefully layered to mask the rot, would vanish. That the oils would wear off. That the air would return to neutral. But it didn't. The fragrance lingered. For weeks, months, years, and not in pleasant ways. It clung to walls, yes, to furniture, to the fabric of pillows too old to wash. But more than that, it clung to perception. People began to doubt their noses. Was that clove in the bakery, or memory? Did the breeze smell of frankincense, or fear? Even in clean cities, people still carried pomanders, not for defense, for reassurance, for a kind of sensory stability. They held them to their lips like rosaries, breathed deeply when the world felt too real. One widow wrote, "I miss the plague, not the dying, the order, the smell of everything trying not to die." It was a terrible thing to admit, but not uncommon, because the world post-plague was not pure. It was uncertain, and the sweet smell of survival, so comforting in the thick of it, became unbearable in peace. It was too much, too heady, too haunting, too close to decay in disguise. A doctor in Hamburg claimed he couldn't eat cooked fruit anymore, said the scent reminded him of the dead. A boy in Lisbon smashed every candle in his house, said the wax smelled like prayer gone stale. Perfume shops closed. Lavender fields were left to wildness. The spice trade dipped not, because people no longer desired it, but because they no longer trusted it. Fragrance had become a lie. Too many bodies had been masked in it. Too many deaths perfumed. Too many memories tucked into satchels meant to protect. And the nose knew. It always knows. So the survivors walked through their cities with narrowed eyes and open nostrils, testing every street, every stall, every stranger. And when the wind shifted, when a trace of sweetness came to sudden, too strong, they turned, because they remembered, because they knew that sometimes the worst smells are not the ones that gag you, but the ones that smile, softly, before the scream. Not everything smelled. That was the horror of it. For all the smoke and sweetness, the rot and ritualsome things passed without warning. No sour breath, no sweating skin, no foul exhalation curling beneath the doorframe, just silence, and then ... gone. People called it the clean death, not because it was gentler. It wasn't. It could be just as swift, just as cruel, but because it gave no clue, no stench, no shift in air, no whisper of warning. A girl might kiss her sister goodnight, only to find her cold by morning. A father might sit beside his son, reading scripture aloud, until the voice went quiet and the lungs stopped without a sound, without a scent. Doctors were baffled. How do you diagnose what does not announce itself? How do you prepare when the very thing you fear smells like nothing at all? They tried to adjust, began to chart patients not by odor, but by stillness, by the lack of smell. A strange reversal. Where once a stench was cause for alarm, now it was absence that bred terror. If your breath remained sweet, were you already lost? This terrified people more than anything. Because humans trust their noses. Instinctively, you don't think before you flinch at a spoiled egg, or draw back from smoke. The nose is our first gatekeeper, our most ancient guardian, and now it was failing. So the fear spread, not just of death, but of the unscented. A woman in Ghent refused to enter her daughter's room for dies not because it stank, but because it didn't. She should have smelled like sickness. She wept, but she didn't, and that's how I knew. Merchants began to fear goods that smelled too clean. No spice means no safety, they muttered. They sought out cinnamon, cloves, anything to re-establish the order of things, anything to make the invisible visible again. Even the churches shifted. Incense grew heavier, masses longer. Scent was used like scripture, like boundary, as if the more they filled the air with meaning, the less space there would be for the void. But it didn't help, because the clean death didn't care for perfume. It came on quiet feet, slipped through scented halls, and left no trace but a name crossed from the parish roll, and a room that smelled of linen, and the hollow, flowerless absence of everything else. Not every house reeked. Some were pristine, cleansed, whitewashed, airy with sun and prayer. They had burned herbs in every corner, washed every sheet in vinegar and wine. The windows were thrown wide, the floors swept. Bowls of lemon peel and hyssop lined the walls, and still they died. Worse, they died quietly, one by one, in rooms that smelled of nothing. There were no signs, no scent of bile, no spoiled meat, just stillness, a kind of clean that felt wrong. The air unmoving, too cold or too calm. Some said it was divine, others were not so sure. In Naples, a house where 7 had died untouched by rot was burned anyway. The neighbors said it was unnatural, that the quiet was suspicious, that there should have been a smell, and because there wasn't, something must be wrong, something worse than the plague. They feared silence more than stink, because silence could not be traced, because silence had no origin, because silence could lie. One friar said the silent rooms felt like walking into the pause between breaths, that you didn't know if the house was waiting or watching, that he lit extra candles, not for light, but for warmth, for presence, for proof that something still moved. And when he left, he never returned. Another woman in York cleaned her dead daughter's room every day for years, not because it needed it, but because it hadn't needed it then. She said, "I keep waiting for the smell, but it never comes. Not even in dreams." The doctors stopped explaining it. Not everything can be explained. Some rooms simply closed themselves, shut down, preserved. Others whispered that such rooms were cursed not by plague, but by memory, that the air had chosen to forget, that grief had bleached the scent from every surface. But even that wasn't true, because if you stood there long enough, if you waited until the shadows stretched just right, until the sun slipped from the window pane, you might catch it. Not a smell, but the edge of one. like the breath of someone who was never there, a ghost of what never rotted, a perfume never worn, the tragedy of a death too fast to smell, too clean to name, too quiet to mourn properly. And perhaps that is its own cruelty, to grieve in a house that does not stink, that leaves no trace, only stillness, only linen, only the unbearable knowledge that death, at its most merciful, may also be the most terrifying. They walked among the living like anyone else, bought bread, drew water, sat in the pews again. But something was missing. It wasn't visible, not at first, but you could tell. They didn't lean into flowers, didn't pause at market stalls to sniff the citrus, didn't press their lips to their child's head and breathe in, because they couldn't. The plague hadn't taken their lives. It had taken their sense of smell, not the same way sorrow dulls it, not like grief, which comes and goes in waves. This was permanent, a hollowing, as if something inside had snapped and never mended. The ancients had no word for it. Modern science would call it anosmia, but back then they called it the glass lung. You could breathe, but nothing passed through. No rot, no rosemary, just air, blank and tasteless. Some said it was a mercy, a final protection from all they had witnessed. But the survivors disagreed. A man in Florence described it as exile. He said, "The city returned, but not to me. I walk among gardens, and I feel nothing. It is as if I live in a painting." A nurse in Bruges wept because she could no longer smell her son's hair. She had survived childbirth, fever, famine, but this broke her. She began burning old clothes, just to see if she could catch a trace, anything, even smoke. Nothing. People grew afraid of these survivors, not because they were contagious, but because they seemed untethered, no longer part of the sensory world, no longer grounded in breath. One priest insisted they wear token sprigs of lavender pinned to their cloaks to remind others they still lived. Not for health, for humanity, but even the lavender wilted, and the survivors adapted. They learnt to cook by texture, to navigate by memory, to raise their children without the reassurance of scent. But they were never whole again, because to live without smell is to live without warning, without flavor, without nostalgia, without that first instinctual recognition of what is safe and what is not. And so they became quiet, not bitter, just faded. And when the breeze stirred the streets of their youth, when others paused to breathe deep, they simply walked on, as if the world no longer called to them, because it didn't. Not anymore. Once, the churches were full of scent. Before the plague, Mass was a symphony of smell wax and incense, damp stone and warm bodies, flowers wilted on the altar, the musk of long-held hymns. It was comforting, familiar, the air thick with belief and breath. But after, they changed. The doors reopened, the candles were lit, the priests returned to the pulpit, but the air had stilled. No incense, no oil, no people packed shoulder to shoulder, singing into each other's skin. It wasn't reverent. It was evacuated, as if the walls themselves had exhaled and refused to inhale again. Worshippers came back slowly. They sat with distance between them, not by law, by instinct. The pews echoed. Even whispers felt too loud, and the air cleaned, sanitized, not by bleach, but by absence. They had stopped burning frankincense in many parishes. Too expensive now, too associated with the dead. One monk said he could not bear the scent anymore. "It smells like the end," he murmured, lighting a plain beeswax taper instead. A few congregations tried to reclaim it. They filled the nave with rosemary, hung garlands of thyme, poured rosewater into the font. It helped a little, but only for the visitors. The old women who had scrubbed the floors during the worst months still wrinkled their noses. The boys who had watched their fathers die in the sacristy still flinched when the candles smoked, because the plague had rewired them. Church was no longer a place of fragrance. It was a place of caution. They breathed shallowly in the chapels, prayed with their mouths closed, avoided hugging during peace. Even the Eucharist changed. No more communal chalice, no more shared loaf. Sanctity became sterile. Holy became scentless. And the priests, they tried. They lit the old censers. They let the bells ring longer. But the air did not thicken again. The breath of centuries had been halted, and in its place a kind of purity, but not the divine kind, the antiseptic kind, the kind that says, here, nothing is alive enough to rot. And in that silence, in that breathless sanctuary, some found peace. Others longed for the stench of a crowded pew, for a church that smelled of candle wax and weeping, for faith that had a body and a breath. It came on a morning so still the bells sounded strange, not muffled, just unaccompanied. The birds were quiet, the leaves motionless. Even the chimneys released their smoke in slow, uncertain curls. And the people of Siena, or maybe it was Gentricords, disagreed outside and sniffed. But there was nothing. No bread baking, no wood burning, no dung, no herbs, no oil, no fear, nothing, not even wind. The air had stopped moving. Some called it a miracle, that after years of scent too thick to breathe, the world had gone neutral, that the plague was truly over, that this blankness was peace. Others knew better. They said it was a warning, because the world never smells like nothing. Even sleep has a scent, even snow, even sorrow. So they watched the sky, waited for the breeze, but it didn't come. By noon, the air felt heavier, not foul, just unmoved, as if the earth had forgotten how to exhale, and with it came unease. Children grew fussy, dogs whined at closed doors, midwives boiled water for no reason. Something had shifted, but they couldn't name it, because scent had always been their signal, their map, and now the compass was broken. They lit candles, opened windows, burned herbs on thresholds, not for cleansing, but for confirmation. If they couldn't smell the rosemary, was it even there? One man walked through the town square carrying a cloved stuffed orange, sniffing it with growing desperation. He collapsed by the fountain, swearing the world had gone hollow. It hadn't, not exactly. By dusk, the breeze returned, slow, soft, carrying the scent of cows in a distant field, the faint tang of fish, smoke from someone's evening fire, and everyone breathed again, not because the smells were pleasant, but because they were present, because they proved the world was still turning, still fermenting, still alive. It became a legend. The day the wind forgot, children were told about it, not to frighten them, but to teach them, always listen to your nose. It knows more than your eyes, more than your tongue, more than the silence. And if ever the world stops smelling, run. It wasn't plague, not this time, just a fever, a chest cold, a scheduled surgery. But the moment she walked into the hospital, she paused. The lights were bright, the tiles clean, the machines murmuring softly to themselves. But the scent, she knew it. Not from this century, not from these walls, but from a book her grandmother wouldn't finish reading, from a cupboard her mother never opened, from a dream of blankets soaked in vinegar and a door closed too slowly. It smelled like memory. The antiseptic temps of alcohol. The underlying warmth of sweat not yet washed. The ghost of herbs in a hallway cleaned too often. She wasn't old enough to have known the plague, but her body flinched anyway, because scent travels through bloodlines, because fear can be inherited. The nurse didn't notice, just offered a clipboard and a smile. But the woman stood there, breathing shallow, pulse rising. It's just a hospital. She told herself that. She told herself it smelled like safety, like healing, but her nose disagreed. Because it wasn't just what was present, it was what was missing. No garlic, no fire, no cloves or pitch, only sterile nothing, which, somehow, was worse. She took the clipboard, sat down, waited for her name to be called, but her breath never deepened, not even once. And when she left after the appointment, after the prescription, after the casual, "You're fine, you're healthy, it's nothing," she walked 10 blocks out of her way, past 3 cafes, and didn't stop until she found the one that smelled like cinnamon, where she sat with her tea, hand trembling slightly on the cup, and tried to forget what she hadn't smelled. Because scent is not just sense, it's signal, and sometimes it whispers in a language you don't remember learning. One passed from plague house to hospital hallway, from grandmother to granddaughter, from rot to rosemary, and back again. They returned, didn't they? The masks, not leather this time, not beaked or waxed or scented with clove and dread, just fabric, disposable, blue and white and damp with breath. But the feeling was older, and the scent, oh, the scent. Hospitals, schools, buses, grocery aisles. Everywhere the air felt unsafe. The masks appeared, and with them that smell, warm cotton, dry skin, a hint of anxiety. Some added perfume, some chewed mint, some dabbed essential oils, as if to say, I still have control. I still choose what I breathe. But under it all, the old fear, the scent of the inside of your own breath, trapped, recirculating, familiar and foreign at once. Some said it was comforting, others felt it creeping in. A nurse in Madrid confessed she kept smelling vinegar that wasn't there. A teacher in Boston said every time she put on her mask, she remembered her great-aunt's attic. She didn't know why. People began talking in whispers again, comparing smells, swapping rituals. Lemon oil for the morning commute, lavender for meetings, eucalyptus in crowded elevators, not to ward off disease, exactly, but to mark territory, to say, this breath is mine, this fear is managed, this scent means I survive. And children, born into it, adapted quickly. They sniffed their masks before putting them on, like checking the weather. They described their classmates by scent. He smells like gum. She smells like oranges. I don't like his mask, it smells like my uncle's basement. No one told them to notice. They just did, because they are the plague children now, and scent is the first language of safety. One woman, a historian by trade, wept when she opened an old box during lockdown. Inside, a plague doctor figurine, beaked and absurd. It had once been a joke, a relic. Now it felt familiar. She pressed her mask to her face and whispered, "We've come full circle." And the room smelled like dust, and something older beneath. Something from a time when breath was dangerous, when masks were not just tools but talismans, and behind them the human face, sweating, praying, waiting. It started small, a niche bottle, a strange name, last breath, moment, nostalgia, no, 7 perfumes, designed not to attract but to remember. The trend caught fire quietly, not in ads, in whispers, in late-night blog posts and quiet TikToks. People describing scents that made them ache, that made them cry, that made them feel less alone. A perfume that smelled like hospital corridors, like old pages and forgotten spices, like the underside of a wool coat worn too long in winter. It wasn't about beauty. It was about truth. These weren't fragrances for seduction. They were for grieving, for grounding, for naming what had gone unsaid. People began to carry them like amulets. A spritz on the wrist before opening the news. A dab behind the ear before visiting the grave. A bottle in the glove compartment just in case. Because the world felt fragile again. Because scent, more than sight or sound, made it real. One line of perfume was called Plague Garden. Its notes, rosemary, myrrh, ash, and something described only as memory. It sold out in a week, not because people liked the way it smelled, but because they recognized it. One man wrote a review. "This is what the air smelled like the day my mother coughed blood. I hate it, I need it. I wear it when I forget what matters." Another wrote, "It smells like my fear, but softer." And that was the power of it. Perfume as artifact, as witness, as grief you can wear. Even corporations caught on. Candle companies released lines with names like Lockdown, March Silence, Bitter Lemon, and Zoom. The irony faded fast. People burned them during dinner, during therapy, during moments when they couldn't speak, because scent tells stories the tongue cannot. And when everything feels too loud, too fast, too bright, you can close your eyes, lift your wrist, and remember who you were before, or who you still are beneath it all. A body breathing, a soul in need of anchoring, and a world, however broken, still rich with fragrance, still full of meaning, still whispering through your nose. You are here, you are here. It's not the sickness that gets you, it's the waiting, the sitting beneath fluorescent lights, the too cold chair, the paper forms, the silence of others doing the same thing, each wrapped in their own private dread. And always, always that smell. Disinfectant, mostly, sharp and sour, a cleanliness so sterile it begins to rot at the edges. But beneath it, plastic chairs warmed by too many bodies. Old coffee, fear seeping from pores and into the air. And something else, not strong, not obvious but present. That undertone of what you might lose. That scent of what you're trying not to imagine. Not the smell of death exactly, but of its shadow, curled like smoke in the corner of the room. Hospitals are designed to be scentless. That's the goal. The architecture of denial. They bleach and seal and vent until the air is blank, until you begin to forget your own body, your own breath. But scent finds a way. A nurse's shampoo, a stranger's coat, the slow decay of hope when no one has spoken your name for hours. It gathers, and for those who've known plague, even in echoes, it's louder than any intercom. A man waiting for test results described it like this. It smelled like the air before my brother's fever, like time and nothing. A woman in oncology whispered, it's the smell of breath held too long. Children fidget, grandmothers fan themselves. Couples hold hands in silence, and still it clings, the fragrance of what might come, and what might not. The quietest kind of horror, because no one screams in waiting rooms. No one weeps not loudly. They inhale and wait, and try not to remember every other room where they've sat exactly like this. every other silence that preceded a name called aloud, every other scent that marked the beginning of the unthinkable. And yet, some bring flowers, some bring oranges, some bring perfume, because the human heart is stubborn, because we still try to overwrite the air, to breathe sweetness into dread, to scent the unbearable, and in that there is something holy, or foolish, or both. It wasn't the sirens. It wasn't the empty shelves, or the tape on the floor, or the headlines screaming numbers. It was the air, the day it shifted. People remember it differently. Some say it started in the supermarkets, a sudden awareness that everything smelled faintly old, fruit just past ripe, plastic warmed by too many fingers, the metallic tang of panic. Others noticed it on their walks, the silence of traffic, the sharpness of tree bark, the scent of flowers too early in bloom. A world paused down, breathing too loud. For many, it was the masks that triggered it, not just the feel of them, the smell of them, like being inside your own fear, like being reminded, with every exhale, that you were made of warmth, that you were porous, that you could carry danger without ever knowing. People started burning candles more often, not for romance, for reassurance. Sandalwood to steady the nerves, lemon to cut the dread, eucalyptus for lungs that might tighten, lavender for loss not yet arrived but already felt. In kitchens across continents, cloves were pressed into oranges again, not because anyone remembered, but because someone remembered. Somewhere in the bloodline, a whisper, this helped once, and it did. Not medically, emotionally. Because when the world smells wrong, we try to set it right. We clean, we boil herbs, we bake, and the bread becomes a beacon. We perfume our wrists with the familiar. We surround ourselves with scent not to forget, but to endure. And as the weeks turned to months, people began to talk about it, that the sky smelled too blue, that the night smelled too quiet, that even the wind had learned hesitation. And through it all, the smallest things became anchors. A coat that still held the scent of a friend's hug. A book that smelled of a used bookstore no longer open. A letter misted with rosewater and grief. Because when you can't touch, and you can't speak, and the world is distant, you smell, you breathe, and the nose, ever faithful, ever human, carries you through. One scent at a time. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand reawakening, no trumpet sound or great parade. Just scent, subtle, lingering, uninvited, but not unwelcome. A warm breeze through an open window, a sharp note of lilac, bread in the oven again, soap that smelled like something other than survival. After years of silence, the world exhaled. The flowers came back, not just in fields, in markets, in doorsteps, in hair. People began to wear fragrance again, not for ritual, but for joy, for flirtation, for remembrance that not every scent had to be tied to mourning. A child in Vienna buried her face in a bouquet and said, "It smells like noise," and it did. Because fragrance, when returned to the unburdened nose, is not background, it is song. People who had lost their smell in sickness and grief reported moments of sudden clarity. A rush of basil while chopping, the scent of shampoo in a crowded train. Tears, uninvited, just from the simple fact of remembering. A woman in Thessaloniki wept at a market because she smelled apricots, not the fruit. The memory of her grandmother's jam, the stove, the skin, the stories. It was resurrection, not of the body, but of the self. Scent became a sign that healing was not theoretical. It was sensory, physical, rooted in the nerve endings. Florists became therapists, perfumers, prophets, people lined up to sniff, not by just be. A man held a sprig of mint to his face and whispered, "I think I'm coming back." Not from death, from numbness, from the place where scent stops reaching and the world goes flat. And as the flowers spread on windowsills, at altars, along sidewalks where funerals once passed, people began to believe that maybe this was grace. Not that the plague had ended, not that the pain was gone, but that the air had forgiven us just a little, and that in every blooming branch, every perfumed scarf, every moment when someone stopped mid-step and smiled, the world was remembering its own breath. It had been a long time since food meant comfort. For so long meals were functional, caloric, measured in vitamins and shelf life, canned beans, rice, dry bread, broths for the sick, bitterness for the well. Smell, if it came at all, was muted like grief, like caution. But then, quietly, joy returned, in the form of garlic sizzling in olive oil, in the warmth of cinnamon rolled into dough, rising on a morning that did not begin with death, in the way a room changes when onions hit the pan. People began cooking for pleasure again, not for survival, not for nutrition, but for the scent of it. They baked cakes just to fill the air, toasted spices not for recipes, but for ritual, left stews to simmer for hours, inviting the aroma to wander, to bless the walls again. A baker in Krakow said his first sourdough after lockdown smelled like forgiveness. A grandmother in Naples taught her grandchildren how to stir ragoon, when to lean in, eyes closed, to memorize. Because the nose doesn't just detect, it remembers, and it tells stories even when we cannot speak. One woman lit a candle not for light, but to carry scent across the house to tell her mother in the next room, "I'm cooking, I'm okay, we're alive today." Restaurants reopened, not with loud fanfare, but with warmth. People passed plates and smiled into steam, not because the food was expensive, because it smelled right, and strangers found themselves crying over rosemary, because it had been too long, because they had forgotten how holy a kitchen could be, not for prayer, but for proof that someone is still home, that something is still rising, that your body in its ache can still want, still hunger, still feel joy in the nose before it ever reaches the tongue. And that scent, more than flavor, is the promise of another day, of breath, of warmth, of not just eating, but living. They didn't speak, not at first. The language had become complicated. Too many months of masks and muted affection. Too many kisses postponed. Too many touches filtered through gloves and fear and careful distance. But when they met finally, fully, it wasn't touch that broke the silence. It was smell. He leaned in. She didn't move away. And for a moment, he simply breathed. No perfume, no cosmetics, just her, skin, salt, warmth, something unmistakably human. She smelled like dust and paper and sun, like a house that had been closed all winter and was now letting the air in again. And that was enough. Words came later. Laughter, the tremble of fingers against skin. But scent arrived first, fierce and undeniable, because the body knows before the mind consents, because scent is a kind of truth that cannot be reasoned with. And after all those months of sterilized everything, sterile rooms, sterile glances, sterile fear, they were desperate for honesty. Lovers across cities found themselves crying in each other's arms, not from the pressure of reunion, but from the way a neck could smell like safety, from the way someone else's hair could carry the scent of almond soap in sleep. No grand declarations, just the ache of proximity, the rediscovery of musk, of heat, of the quiet perfume of the back of a knee, the sigh in a collarbone. A man in Lyon said his husband's chest smelled like home, like before, like always. He pressed his face there and did not speak for hours. A woman in Montreal described her wife's skin as grapefruit and fire and the end of loneliness. There was no need for cologne, no need for candles, just breath, shared again, unmasked, unafraid. And in that closeness, that invisible exchange, something ancient returned, something that plague had not taken, that fear had not buried, that grief had not soured, the scent of another human being, present, willing, alive. And in that moment, every lover remembered, before we touched, before we kissed, before we knew the shape of each other's voices, we smelled, and it was enough. He was born after the masks had been folded away, after the candles were blown out, after the bodies were named and buried and mourned. But the air still carried it, whatever it was. He couldn't name it. He was too young to remember the silence, the sirens, the scented cloths tucked in drawers. But the first time he visited his great-grandmother's house, he stopped at the door, sniffed, wrinkled his nose, asked, "Why does it smell like waiting?" No one had taught him that word. Not like that. Not with that meaning. But every adult in the room went still, because they knew they had lived it. And the boy, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't even curious. He just said it the way children do, with the soft certainty of the unscarred. Then he walked in, touched the furniture, sat beside the old woman who smelled of cloves and sadness, and asked for cake, as if the world hadn't paused once, as if breath had never been dangerous, as if the nose, clean and clear, could simply follow sweetness again. That night, his grandmother, who had not worn perfume in years, took down a bottle from a high shelf, something amber, something floral, something that reminded her of her wedding day. She dabbed it at her throat, inhaled, and wept, not from grief, from memory, from the way her grandson had named a thing she thought had no name. The smell of waiting, of liminality, of time suspended in breath, and how it was lifting now, not gone, never gone, but softened, fading, leaving room for cake again, for perfume, for a child's nose to wrinkle in delight instead of fear. And so she let it go, opened every window, let the wind carry her scent into the street, and somewhere below, someone paused, sniffed, and smiled, not because they knew her, but because something sweet had come from above, and the air at last was learning to sing again. He hadn't been inside a church in years, not because he stopped believing, but because the last time he'd knelt in the pew, the air had smelled wrong, too clean, too sharp. No incense, no wax, just bleach and silence. He couldn't pray in that. He couldn't breathe in that. But one day, without planning to, he walked past an open chapel door and stopped. Something pulled him. Not the hymn, not the light, the scent. Someone had lit the old thurible again, frankincense. Myrrh smoke curling like memory into the rafters. It was faint, just a thread in the air, but it gripped him. He stepped inside, and everything came rushing back. Not just faith, presence, the kind that lives in the nose before it ever reaches the mind, the kind that says, "You are not alone." He didn't kneel, he didn't cross himself. He just stood, eyes closed, breathing. Behind him, someone whispered a prayer. Beside him, someone wept. And above them, the incense rose, lazy and sacred, not to cover anything, not to mask, but to reveal. Because holy things have always had a scent. Bread, broken, wine, sour and red, candles sputtering into their own wax. Old wood, old stone, old faith, and now, returning, one breath at a time. He came back the next day, and the day after that, he began to light a taper each time. He brought his own herbs, once a handful of crushed rose, a pinch of thyme. The priest didn't ask questions, he only nodded, because he, too, had noticed the way the church filled again, not with people, not just, but with fragrance, a flock of invisible believers trailing scent behind them like prayers. And though no one said it aloud, they all felt the same truth. That belief, like grief, like joy, like fear, returns through the nose, and that to find God again, sometimes all you need is a breath of smoke in an empty room. It's easy to think the plague ended, that it came and went, and was buried in books and bones, that history sealed it off like a tomb, that the stench dissipated. But some things are not so easily dismissed. They linger in alleys too narrow for sunlight, in corners of old churches where no candle burns, in tapestries that have hung too long in the same place. You'll find it in strange places, not the full reek, not the sour, suffocating musk of death, just a note, a whisper, a single thread of scent stitched into the air. You turn a corner, and something pulls you back. Not fear, recognition. A draft from an open cellar. A box disturbed in the attic. The dry rot behind the walls of an old inn. You inhale, and the past exhales. And for a breath, for the smallest of moments, you are no longer where you stand. You are there, someone else. The plague doesn't return. Not exactly, but your body does. The same way grief can revisit a kitchen. The same way a song can send you reeling. The same way love is triggered by a coat in winter that still smells like someone who no longer writes. The plague, too, left its scent, etched into the walls of Europe, into the fear muscle behind the nose, into the rituals we carry without knowing, candles, cloves, clean sheets, the instinct to open a window, and every once in a while the world reminds you, a wind from the east, a cluster of crows, a fever that comes too fast, and your body remembers, not panic, not exactly, but reverence, stillness, a pause at the threshold of a room, a second thought before touching the doorknob, and sometimes a breath drawn a little deeper to test the air, to listen, to know, because the plague taught us that breath is not just life, it is history, and it never leaves the room quietly. You don't need to have lived through it to carry it. The scent, the memory, the instinct to flinch when vinegar boils, or to pause when incense curls the wrong way in the breeze. Some inherit wealth, others inherit trauma, but some inherit smell, passed down like recipes, like lullabies, like the stories that are never fully told, only hinted at between spoonfuls of soup or over the folding of linen. A grandmother tells you to keep rosemary by the windowsill. A father insists on burning sage in the winter months. No one explains why, but you do it. And one day, walking past a bakery, or a burned-out field, or a child with garlic on their breath, you feel it. Not fear, not clarity, something else. A pull, as if your nose has reached further back than your own life. As if a part of you is suddenly aware that it was once someone else's body, someone else's lungs, someone else's trembling hand lighting the candle during a time when the world smelled of ruin. This is the inheritance, not in objects, in responses, a love of citrus in spring, a distrust of silence in the garden, the ache in your chest when the wind smells too clean. You didn't ask for it, but it's yours. And sometimes that burden becomes blessing. You know when to open the window. You know when to trust your gut. You know when someone you love smells wrong, even before they do. And when grief comes, and it always does, you know how to scent the house. You know how to light the herbs. You know how to say goodbye. Because scent, passed down, teaches what the mouth forgets. It's the muscle memory of survival. It's the ghost in your breath that tells you you are not the first. You will not be the last. But you know what to do. And somewhere in the dark, that knowledge is a kind of light. Time doesn't march. It breathes in and out. Inhale the fire, exhale the ash. Inhale the joy, exhale the grief. The centuries are not a staircase, but a lung. And when you look back, really look, you'll notice the rhythm. The plague was not the only horror, not the only silence, not the only scent that made the world pause. There were others. Wars that made the air taste like metal. Storms that left mildew in their wake. Entire years that smelled of coal and hunger and hands too tired to make bread. And still we breathe. Even now, as you sit here half dreaming, maybe the breath continues. Yours, mine, the world's. The plague took many things, but it did not take that. It tried, oh, it tried. It clawed at the lungs, stole the breath of children, the scent of joy, the ability to trust the air. It taught us to fear exhalation, to flinch at coughs, to question the safety of a kiss. But it failed, because we keep inhaling. We keep leaning into flowers, into kitchens, into each other. And the air, though sometimes sharp, sometimes cruel, keeps offering itself back, unconditionally, a breath in, a breath out. You may be centuries away from the plague carts, the fumigated doorways, the masked doctors in bird-bone beaks, but you are not far from their breath. You carry it. The proof is in your rituals, the clove tucked in your tea, the lemon you press against your wrist, the sigh you let out when the house is quiet again. That is the inheritance. Not the fear, not the flame, but the choice to breathe again, to scent the world even when it hurts, to smell, and in smelling, remember that you are here, alive, and every breath you take, whether sweet or bitter, is shared with the ghosts who breathed before you and the ones who will breathe after. It happened quietly. No sirens, no sky turning strange, no sudden shout across the city square, just a stillness. The kind that wraps around you before you notice, the kind you feel in the base of your throat. And then the realization there's no wind, no rustling, no creaking shutters, no curtain fluttering against the open window, and worse, no smell, no perfume, no dinner, no dog, no dust, just flat, silent air. It didn't last long, maybe 2 hours, maybe less, but those who noticed would never forget. One woman in Oslo said she lit every candle in her house, just to see if the wax would stir. A boy in Marrakesh climbed onto the roof, hoping for breeze, found only sky. In Chicago, a man woke from a dream where his childhood home had no walls, just corridors of scentless space, and found his room exactly as he'd left it. But wrong. People reached for their masks, not because they feared disease, but because it felt like armor, against nothing, against too much nothing. Later, they would say it was a freak weather pattern, a low-pressure system, a coincidence. But those who had lived through the plague really knew better. They whispered to each other the next day, asked if anyone else had noticed. Most lied and said no, too afraid to name it, too afraid to believe it might be back. But not everyone was afraid. Some stood on their balconies that night, heads tilted, nostrils open, not searching for scent, but bearing witness. Because sometimes absence is holy. A breath held too long is still a breath, and the return of wind when it comes, and it always comes, is sweeter for the silence. So when the breeze returned just before dawn, carrying jasmine or chimney smoke or the warm scent of city stone, they didn't flinch. They inhaled deeply, gratefully, because now they knew that even the wind forgets sometimes. Even the air gets tired. Even the world needs a moment to remember how to breathe. It's late, you're here, and somewhere beneath the hum of your thoughts, beneath the memories you didn't mean to unpack, tonight there is a scent. Maybe you don't notice it at first. Maybe it's your sheets, your skin, the corner of the pillow that still carries the echo of someone else. Or maybe it's something imagined, something your nose remembers, even if your mind doesn't. Burned sugar, books left open too long, a candle blown out but not forgotten. Whatever it is, it's yours. No plague here. Not now, just you. Alive, breathing. And if you close your eyes, if you let the quiet settle, your nose will lead you through the centuries. Past the clove-stuffed masks, past the gardens pretending not to be graves, past the kitchens and the cathedrals and the waiting rooms and the lovers leaning close, all the way back to a room with no light, no sound, only air, thick with rosemary and grief. Someone sits beside you. They are not afraid. They are watching you breathe. They don't need to speak. They know the truth. That scent is the soul's memory. That your nose, even now, even here, is bearing witness to life, to death, to everything in between. So inhale, gently. Let the air wrap around you like a hand. Let the night carry you. There are no more parts to tell, only the scent of something ending and something beginning. Sleep now. I'll stay with you until the room forgets we were ever here. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. Whether you drifted off halfway through or stayed with me to the end, I'm glad you were here. If you felt something tonight, comfort, curiosity, maybe even the quiet echo of your own memories, I hope you'll come back again. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can subscribe, only if it feels right. No pressure, just a gentle invitation to stay a while. Until next time, breathe deep, sleep soft, and let the night hold you kindly. Good night.